All right. Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation to come be here and the nice introduction. Okay, and yes, the Zoom controls have been hidden. Now they're anyway. I don't think we'll get in the way of anything. They're up there. You can watch along with me as the chat number counter. But yeah, if anything shows up in the chat, let me. Yeah, if you're watching that. Yeah, and in general, I guess, yeah, this is happy to have this be interactive and take questions as we go. So, yeah, questions occur to you. Great. So I want to talk about some work I've been doing over the past couple of years with my former PhD student, Manish Raghavan, who's now at junior faculty at MIT, and with Senthil Milanathan, who I've been working with over a number of years now, who's a behavioral economist at the University of Chicago. And this grew out of in part out of a series of really interesting conversations that we've been having over the past few years with people at different large social media platforms about this, this question of really understanding what it is that users want out of social media, how social media can be a good experience for people, and trying to understand this paradox that I think people in the social media industry feel keenly, that a lot of optimization goes into what gets presented to you. And somehow qualitatively, and a lot of people have the sense that, the more the platform optimizes for some users, the unhappier they get, right? People feel like they're having a frustrating experience on social media. They're not getting what they wanted out of social media. And the fact that the platform is optimizing, even though it's trying to optimize for user satisfaction, sometimes seems like it's making the problem worse, not better. And how is that possible, right? So we want to think about this question, how can all these things be going on simultaneously, right? That we have these platforms with a huge amount of data about users. Even if we imagine that they are trying to sort of genuinely increase user happiness, it's not clear the optimizations that they're doing are achieving that, even though they're trying to use the data as best they can. Okay, so in some sense, we arrived at this question, through sort of the broader issue of thinking about social media. You have to recharge this. And the issue was, I'm just not screen focus. There we go. Cool. And so, there's this broader question. I've been interested in social media for over a long period of time, and these, roughly 10 years ago, the kinds of questions that I would think about is, the idea that the social media system is embedded in some larger social system, right? So, 10 years ago, we would look at pictures like this picture of a user's Facebook network neighborhood. Some of these have even displayed on slides, talks at CMU in the past. Or we would look at the diffusion of political ideas, right? How a chain letter petition might spread out through a network of email, for example, right? And so there's this ambient social system that all of this is taking place in. And it's important to remember, how effortlessly our brains map these kinds of social connections as we encounter them online, right? That we're doing it constantly without even thinking about the fact that we're doing it, right? And sometimes I take screenshots of things that remind me of this fact. So spring 2016, the Democratic primary season before the 2016 presidential election, Rolling Stone, sometime around March 2016, decided to endorse Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary season, relative to Bernie Sanders would have been their other natural option. And Matt Taibbi, who was a sometime writer for Rolling Stone, was unhappy with this and expresses displeasure. And apparently, according to this blog called thepeoplesview.net, which I've never seen before or since, I just took the screenshot of it. Apparently, a millennial had a brilliant response to Matt Taibbi's displeasure. Okay, and so you encounter this online, you're scrolling through, and you see this headline pop up: a brilliant response from millennial to Matt Taibbi's displeasure for Rolling Stones. And your brain processes all of that, and you actually have to pause and realize how large a cast of characters there is in that sentence, right? Because this is not a story about Hillary Clinton, or even a story about Rolling Stones endorsing Hillary Clinton, right? Rather, Matt Taibbi, who I've spelled correctly in the figure, which I did here. Rather, Matt Taibbi apparently was not happy with Rolling Stone's endorsement. And there was a millennial who apparently had a brilliant response, but you're not actually hearing from the millennial. You're hearing from the peoplesview.net, who wanted to tell you about this. right? So we're at least 5 steps removed from the primary source material of this hardware. This is the kind of social connectivity that these online media enable. And this is, one thing you encounter in your feed as you scroll through, and your brain just fills in all of those bubbles, right? That's the complexity of the structure that we're doing. I mean, of course, if I want to be pedantic, I could point out that you're not actually reading the peoplesview.net. You're actually listening to me give a talk about this, where even more steps were removed by the time we get here. So, right, social media has this inherently social component, but that's not new, right? In some sense, all media is social, right? This is one of the sort of fundamental principles of the sociology of mass communication, as expressed by people like Elwood Katz and Paul Lazarsfeld in the middle of the 20th century, right? And actually, in a workshop in 2004 in New York City, I had the pleasure of actually meeting Elwood Katz, who was at that point very late in his career. And in 2004, I was thinking about blogging, and I was thinking about the 2004 presidential election and its consequences there. And had a fascinating time talking with Elwood Katz, who had, in his own way, 50 years earlier, been thinking about the disruptive effect of technological change on the political process. In his case, the disruptive technologies were radio and TV. Now we think about social media, but it was sort of amazing just to sort of hear about how similar the considerations were, right? The concern people had about the way TV was amplifying partisan polarization, was amplifying misinformation, giving certain people a megaphone to broadcast ideas they wouldn't otherwise have had, right? A lot of these same kind of considerations. And fundamentally, although we think of TV as mass communication, right? That it just saturates the landscape with this broadcast message. What they found in the studies that they did was actually that there was really this two-step flow of information, right? And this again became one of the most fundamental principles of the sociology of mass communication, right? As they say, when they looked at what had actually contributed to people's decisions on how to vote, it was really less about broadcast media, and it was more of other people, right? The message enters the social system and it moves around. So their point is all media is social, right? The medium is the starting point with which we have the conversations that then actually influence people's opinions. But if all media is social, then what's special about modern social media, right? Why do we sort of single it out and say it's somehow worthy of separate study? And increasingly, it seems like a key component of it is that modern social media is algorithmic media. It's not just that it's social. It's not just that we map out these connections of who said what and who agreed with him and who disagreed with him, but rather that it's being computationally mediated, right? No matter, and I'm telling you things that you all obviously know very well, that the fact that your feed is being curated to you, that's a level of scale in the individualization and personalization that we just haven't had previously. And so that's something that we want to think about, right? The ways in which the algorithmic amplification in particular can lead to forms of conflict that weren't present just with the pure social connectivity. Yeah.
So in that research from the 50s, when you say other people, since communication between people was just like either by in person or by a telephone.
Yeah.
Back then, really.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
That is what I mean. Yeah. So in fact, the two-step flow theory of mass communication, which came out of their work, effectively said that media saturates everybody, but certain people are particularly avid consumers of media. They're really up on the news. They just follow things. And so when you ask people like, what influenced your decision to vote, they'd say, oh, I have this coworker who reads the news a lot, and they told me about this candidate, or they made me realize the candidate I liked wasn't actually as good as I thought, and they made me think this other thing. So people often pointed to like a friend of theirs who was a major follower of the news. And so the two-step and two-step flow means the news saturates everybody, but certain people really become expert in the news just out of a passion for it. They're just into reading the news, and then they in turn tell all of the people around them, and they tell them actually in conversation and working on it. Exactly. And so, right, so there's now this element of intermediation, right? And so what kinds of conflicts do we see as a result? And I want to talk about a particular form of conflict, which is not going to be any of these, right? There's been a lot of work in interpersonal conflict over the last few years, right? The ways in which algorithmic amplification might contribute, for example, to polarization, to growth of misinformation, to the way in which potentially radicalization pathways can develop through targeted recommendations, although the empirical evidence for this is not as strong as the anecdotal evidence, right? The way in which targeted attacks might take place, adversaries intervening, trying to sow conflict specifically. But in these conversations that we had over the past couple of years with teams at these large social media platforms, this was sort of more well-trodden territory. But there was this other thing that almost fell below the surface that hadn't been addressed as much, which is the ways in which social media doesn't just create conflicts between people, it creates conflicts within people, right? Not just the conflicts that you have with the person you meet on the platform, but now the conflicts that the algorithmic amplification generates inside yourself. So what do I mean by that? Like, what do I mean by a conflict takes place within you? Well, intuitively, we also kind of know about this, right? The fact that we have to, create a term called doom scrolling means that, there's a part of you that, wants to keep looking at your Twitter feed to find out, all the terrible things that are going on in the world, to read more, on Twitter about rising COVID case counts and new variants and so forth. And there's a part of you that would very much like to stop doing that. Because it just stresses you out and you think it's a sort of no purpose, right? Right. So there's somehow this internal sense that you both keep scrolling and you'd also like to stop scrolling, right? The fact that you have posts on Reddit about Facebook quitting advice from a professional internet quitter, or this question that titled a different Reddit post, how do I spend less time on YouTube? My question is, the answer ought to be obvious, right? It ought to be obvious how to spend less time on YouTube, right? It's a discrete website. All it takes is to not go to it. But we sort of all understand that it's not actually that simple, right? These are not conflicts you're having with other people. These are not fights you get into on social media. This is rather some kind of a fight you're having with yourself. You would like to stop, you would like to consume less, and yet somehow you aren't. Okay. And so there's been a sort of beginnings of a line of work here that we wanted to think about. And here too, there's some kind of a diagram, right? There is actually a split here, that there's a part of you that wants to use Facebook. There's a part of you that wants to override the part of you that wants to use Facebook, and different sides are sort of, trying to help different parts of you in this process. Okay, so this is a problem of self-control, right? This is a problem of there's, party that wants to do something, party that doesn't want to do something, and you have a self-control problem, and you'd like assistance in solving your self-control problem. And so, and again, we, the three of us, represented some kind of hybrid research group here of computer science and behavioral science. And for this, we looked at, what is known, in the sort of enormous body of literature about the behavioral science of self-control problems, and how does that really potentially intersect with algorithmic optimizations? Okay, so let's talk a little about self-control problems. So fundamentally, the behavioral science of self-control is about the conflict between want and should, right? So, you're at a workshop and there's food put out, and you want the chips, but you should have the salad. And obviously, this is not, there's been a lot of empirical work on food consumption, in particular the self-control problems that arise there. Closer to what we'll be talking about, although we'll think about the analogies to food, is the kind of conflict, similar conflicts arise in media consumption, right? You're on a plane, there are 2 hours before you land, you're thinking maybe you will watch a movie on the plane, and you have various options, right? You sort of, think, well, maybe I should watch this fascinating documentary about the font Helvetica, and then I could learn a lot of things, and it actually is a surprisingly good movie. And a lot of things I can, have, work in the conversation, I'll learn something important, but I sort of want to watch the Marvel movie, right? And it's very much the same sort of conflict, right? So there's sort of the part that appeals to some part of you, right? The Helvetica movie actually says, start watching with your public library card or university login. I guess they've accurately guessed that the only people who might possibly watch this either have a public library card or university login. But either way, there's this, right? It very much is the sort of the chips versus salad kind of thing. Now, these are things that people have actually done a bunch of behavioral science in empirical work on, right? Like, we feel intuitively there's some conflict. And we sort of know certain things about this conflict, right? For example, we sort of intuitively believe that the part of us that believes we should do something is thinking about the future. It's planning for the future. It's saying this will benefit me down the road, like eating salad will be healthier down the road. And the part of you that wants to do things is thinking of the present. It wants to do it now. And in fact, a lot of the empirical research has shown that actually that kind of time and consistency is central to these want versus should conflicts. So just to take some examples from both the food and media domain, in some of the early empirical work by this team of Milton, Rogers, and Bazerman. So for example, online grocery orders gives us data where we can look at some of this. You look at online grocery orders and you look at, when you ask for the food to show up, right? You can place the order to arrive today. You can place the order to arrive 3 days from now, for example. And what they found is that actually, in a manual classification of food by want versus should, since most of us agree on that rough distinction, you can actually find that online grocery orders contain more should items and they're placed to be received further in the future. And that's even controlling for like freshness, spoilage, and all those other things that might confound it. Similarly, actually, the mail ordered DVD era, right? So Netflix, some of you directly recall, some of you, know as a historical fact that Netflix was originally a mail order company, right? You went online and you said, I want these DVDs to arrive in the mail, and there's all this thing about like managing your queue of DVDs that arrived in the mail, you put it in your DVD player, and then you would mail them back, and it was like a public library, you're allowed to have a certain number of things up. And then circa 2010, Netflix switched because it saw the way the world was going, and it certainly was going that way, and became a streaming company. And in the process, they did a massive natural experiment, where they touched off a massive natural experiment, because Netflix of 2007, 2008 was a company where all the preferences being expressed by users were, what do I believe I'm going to want to watch 3 days from now? And 3 days from now, you're like, I'm gonna have some time on my hands. I'm gonna be really wanting to learn something. I should really watch a documentary about a font, like a documentary about Helvetica. And so you would, your should self was sort of more in control because you're thinking about what you might want to do 3 days from now. Suddenly they switched to streaming, which they did for all sorts of obvious reasons, not because of the want should distinction. But suddenly, as a user, you're asking yourself a very different question. You're like, what do I want to watch right now? I click a button, and literally within 10 seconds, I will be watching this movie. A very different set of calculations comes into play. And so one thing that people studied was, for example, the way preferences changed. And there was actually an irony here, because this change actually happened just after Netflix had run its much celebrated Netflix prize competition, which gave a huge boost to the recommender system community. This was 2009. They ran this $1 million prize competition to improve their recommendations. And the recommendations were all based on a data set from the way they ran their business at the time, which was mail order. And so all those models were trained on data from the mail order era. And then they did this massive discontinuous change to the streaming era. And they basically had to rethink all their, both conceptually, but also just the data is now different, right? The preference being expressed are different. And so this is, you can even see evidence of this in the mail order, right? So a study that Milton, Bazerman, and Rogers did in the mail order era was actually to look at violations of the hypo principle, even in mail order, right? That you would order some DVDs and you would order A before B, but you'd return B before A, suggesting that when B arrived, it jumped the queue and you watched it first. And often when that happened, B was a want movie and A was a should movie, right? When the want movie showed up, it jumped ahead of the order which you actually requested. Okay, all of these things going on. But this also starts to tell us something that is going to be key to setting up this whole question, which is that there's us talking about this conceptually, us imagining what's going on in the user's mind, but we don't have access to the user's mind. We have their clicks. We have to figure out what they want. And if there are really these two competing sets of preferences, but they're being multiplexed through a single sequence of clicks, and all we have is the clicks, what do we make of that? Like, how do we think about that? Right? So that's the issue, right? That the basic question platforms have to answer is, what do users want? And let's imagine, there's sort of obviously two interpretations of reality here, right? There's an interpretation in which platforms are not really concerned about what users want, right? They're driven by a profit motive and they're simply cynically exploiting users. But in some sense, there's also this question that even the platform's interest is to keep users there, right? A platform that chases users away because they overconsume, they binge, and then they decide I no longer want to be here is not actually going to, it's going to succeed in the extremely short term. But we're looking at platforms that have succeeded over a long term. They somehow succeeded in keeping users wanting to be there. And so even if their objectives are self-centered, they're self-centered in the sense of they need to keep users wanting to come there, right? And so something which destroys user utility is not necessarily in the long-term interest. So let's imagine that they are trying to figure out what do users want. And how are they going to go about doing this? Well, in some sense, a fundamental principle of user modeling, a principle so basic that we often sort of don't even include it as an assumption what we're doing, is the principle of reveal preference, right? People choose what they want, so choice should reveal preference, right? And certainly over many years, I've given talks where I've said, part of the power of the online world compared to the offline world is that we have every click that every user makes, right? We see in enormous detail exactly what they wanted to do. And it's essential, right? We can't give up that data. The huge leverage that a social media platform has over a print newspaper is that the print newspaper has no idea exactly where you're looking on the page or what you spent time on, and the website does, right? This is the sort of the oldest sales pitch in the world for like why the online world gives you all the power. But the challenge is that if you don't have just one set of preferences, if you have multiple competing sets of preferences, they don't get to speak separately through your clicks. They speak together through your clicks in some complicated, choreographed kind of conflict that they're having. And that's what we have to disentangle. That's what we often don't think very hard about disentangling, right? We tend to start from revealed preference. You have preferences, your clicks are going to reveal them, I'm going to optimize today. What if we actually try to take seriously the idea that there isn't just one set of preferences, right? To take this principle in behavioral science and say, ultimately, we need a kind of behavioral theory of recommendation, not just inferential theory of recommendation. Okay, what would that look like? So the challenge, of course, just to kind of go back to the food analogy, right? The platform faces the same problem that, say, your host at a party does. You're standing next to a bowl of chips, mindlessly eating them, and now you've emptied out the bowl of chips, right? Your host sees the bowl is empty. Now, part of you hopes, that the host comes back with a refilled bowl of chips. Part of you really hopes the host takes the empty bowl back in the kitchen and just leaves it there, right? And saves you from eating more chips, right? And the host is somehow supposed to recognize like which state you're in, what you would actually prefer simply from your actions, right? And often your host has some, because they're a human being like you are, has some sophisticated sense of like what to do there. But of course, the problem is the internet platform will just refill the bowl of chips every time, right? That's what it's designed to do, because it's just looking at, right? The whole principle is to give you more of what you want. Okay, so what if we didn't want that to be the principle? Then we need some sort of a model that included users that had competing sets of preferences, right? With which we could then interpret click data or what's happening with click data, right? We would have to express that in terms of some kind of a model. So let's think about that. What would a model like that look like? And think about that. Here's a sort of set of 3 points that we want to think about. So one is, the point is not that revealed preference is right or that revealed preference is wrong. The point is that whether it leads to the correct conclusion is going to be specific to the particular pieces of content, right? Revealed preference might be something different with salad with chips, and so it isn't to say that social media is not monolithic, right? Social media has enormous heterogeneity of things, and it's really more about understanding what kinds of content trigger what kinds of behavior. And so that's the question that we'd like to ask the platforms. And again, just a kind of something that we all know, the problem is much more complicated with large internet platforms, right? Even the largest grocery store in the world, which faces some of these questions, has maybe 50 to 100,000 products versus the billions of items which are on YouTube constantly being reconfigured, minute by minute. Okay, let's try making up a model that addresses all this. So in the paper, we have a sequence of models that get progressively more complicated. I wanted to start with sort of the simplest one, just so that we could all process it in real time. Because in the simplest version of the model, there's actually, the calculations are not difficult, and we end up with a sort of qualitative conclusion that actually seems to capture what we've been discussing sort of in these more informal. So in the simplest model, let's imagine that you're just scrolling through a linear content feed, right? A Twitter timeline, a Facebook news feed, a YouTube playlist, a sort of linear TikTok scroll, right? So you're consuming a linear content feed with items 0, 1, 2, and so forth. And so the decision you're making is just, do I want to continue on to the next item or do I want to stop? Right. And then later we can add things like, there's a sidebar with recommendations, it's branching, you have to choose which one you want. But let's start with this. And the user has two sets of preferences. In the sort of language of this behavioral science work, in the language of thinking fast and slow, Danny Kahneman's book, we'll call them system 1 and system 2. Now, system 1 and system 2 are kind of two characters who show up metaphorically in lots of stories from behavioral sciences. And they mean different things in different contexts, but they always mean system 1 is the one which acts first, right? It's quick, impulsive, heuristic. System 2 acts second, it acts slower. It thinks about the long range and capable of engaging in planning. All right, so for our purposes, system 1 is the impulsive want system, and system 2 is the planning should system. Okay, so how do each of them handle this linear feed of content? So system 1 is fast, it acts first. Then let's say item T produces some utility U sub T for system 1, drawn from some distribution U. But because system 1 is really incapable of planning, it sees the chip and it eats it. That's basically how far ahead it's able to think. We don't need to know much about
chips are all different.
Sorry?
Each chip is a little bit different.
Each chip is a little bit different.
Distribution comes in, right?
That's where distribution comes in.
Yeah.
Yep. Very, very much so. Yeah. Right. And the chips are sort of sequenced. So like you go do it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. And so the main thing we actually care about is if system 1 just says, if my utility is positive for this next step, I'll just do it. I don't really care where it leads. I just care if it's positive. So we'll say this distribution U produces a positive number with probability P and a non-positive number with probability 1 minus P. And let's say if the utility is positive on this current thing, then system 1 continues on to item T plus 1. And actually, a fine-grained detail, I'll just make the analysis a little easier. We're going to imagine that this should be made while it's consuming item T, right? So while you're watching the T video, if system 1 is engaged, it's prepared to jump ahead, right? Yeah.
Does utility mean something special here, or just a form of random?
Utility, right? So in some sense, system 1 is acquiring utility. Like I can add up the utility system 1 has gotten over all the time. So it's a number, but in some sense, we're going to sort of think about this story from system 2's point of view. And so in that sense, system 2 is a little less concerned what system 1 is gaining and mainly concerned about is it positive and it goes in. Yeah. But we'll next time we'll get to system 2 utility and that'll be something that we add up.
So UT should be somewhat optimized for system 2, should I think of?
Yeah, let's think about this as the utility for system 1.
Oh, okay.
Let's now talk about system 2 also gets utility drawn from a different distribution B. So there's basically system 1 utility, system 2 utility. And they don't have to be completely misaligned, right? So like you're seeing something that's very, kind of engaging in system 1, but system 2 might say, yeah, this is very useful. I'm enjoying it, right? You're watching some really engaging educational video. System 1 is very engaged by all the flashing stuff and whatever. But system 2 is also like I'm actually learning something. That's right. Versus there could be things where they're completely misaligned. You're sitting through the review session for your calculus final. This is very important to you. You are going to stay there, but system 1 is like, please, can't we leave, right? So, so then you can have them both aligned or misaligned. So for system 2, there's a different distribution B. And here we're going to actually add up utility because in the end, system 2 is going to say, did I get positive total utility out of this experience or negative total net utility out of this experience? So item T gives system 2 some utility B sub T, has a mean B bar. Now, yeah.
The analogy we were making before was to like putting things on watch video and Netflix. How does that translate to the newsfeed?
Yeah. So I think the actual managing a queue for Netflix for watching later, we'll come back to this. That arguably is an inherently system 2 activity, right? That it's actually planning. So I think that it's going to be less the sort of proactive Netflix queue management for the future is going to less fit this model. This is more like you're scrolling right now. So you're scrolling through TikTok, you're scrolling through Twitter. You're trying to decide, do I keep going or do I stop? And we're going to try to capture the idea that in the moment you keep scrolling, later you regret having all the time you spent, right? And can we build a model that has both of those ingredients? So if we somehow succeed in setting all this up right, we should be able to simultaneously say, you're gonna spend a long time here. Later, you're gonna say, that was stupid, I actually, wish I hadn't done that. And let's see if we end up, so, okay, so there has to be the idea of like, you could choose to leave. Now, why would you choose to leave? Well, let's say that you have some outside option W for leaving the site. Right, so W is the payoff you would get if you stop scrolling and whatever, like get on with the rest of your life. And you get half W. So the net utility of minor t is VT minus W. Okay, so the utility of the current item is known. The utility of future items is not known, but you know the distribution. So system 2, which is capable of planning, is there, and they say, okay, in the future, my expected net utility from all future things is V bar minus W. Right? I get V bar, but I lose the outside option of W every time I see it. Okay, now if it were just that, there'd be no reason why system, say V bar is bigger than W. Then even a system 2 which plan under our model so far would stay there forever. Because every item is giving it positive net utility, because V bar minus W is positive. And clearly, eventually system 2 wants to leave. So we need a third thing, right? So far we have system 1's utility. So we have system 2's utility. We need some notion of satiation. We need some notion that, there's diminishing marginal gain from being there, even if you're enjoying the content. So somehow we have to have that as our third component. And if we have those three things, we'll have it'll be expressive enough to do it. So why does system 2 eventually want to leave? The simplest formulation of some kind of diminishing returns or satiation, there are several ways to do this. One is that at some point, system 2 is going to satiate. Now, we could do this kind of gradually deterministically. So for example, I could say t steps in, the value is v sub t times some discount factor, some number, 1 minus epsilon to the tth power. And so the quality is decaying exponentially. And there's a version of the paper where we do that. But because there's a little more calculation involved, and I want to sort of have something we can all process, there's something which works almost exactly the same way, which is that system 2 undergoes a simple on-off transition. In every step, at some moment, right? So after every step, it flips a coin. With probably Q, it wants to keep going. And probably 1 minus Q, it decides, I'm done, I'm now full, and I would like to stop. Right. So in this sense, the length of the session that system 2 wants is this geometrically distributed random variable, which the end is going to come at some moment when it decides, okay, I'm now full, I would like to stop. Okay. So system 2, because it's capable of planning, knows that the probability that we'll still be interested t steps from now is Q to the t. Right, because the coin will have to come heads t times in a row.
Is there some discounting factor with the outside option? Like if I decide to go to t plus 1, I can still get the utility W if I step up. So if I'm planning, why not wait it out until B is 0, and then I step out to get W?
If I knew a deterministic schedule of how V was diminishing, that'd be true. But remember, V is a draw from a distribution, so I only know in the future. Yeah.
So if these VTs are drawn randomly from this distribution that has negatives in the support, do we need to have this kind of discounting? It would happen eventually that the some VT plus is going to be negative.
Yeah. So right. So in some sense, the VT is a sunk cost on the principle that you only know how much you enjoy this content when you're consuming it. So I get this video which I had expected value V bar bigger than W. I say, let me go on. I'm like, oh, this video is terrible. It's negative. That's now a sunk cost. You've seen the video. And for the future, if V bar is bigger than W still, then the expected benefit of the future is still large. I agree. And this actually gets to a subtlety. Yeah, there's a lot of choices in the model. Another version of the model that we've looked at, which gets a little more complicated, is I can preview the very next video. I can go, yes, in principle, V bar is bigger than W, but I see the preview of this next video, it's boring. And then there's a slightly more complicated calculation that goes on. You might leave because of that anyway. Yeah, I agree. But we're in the simplest version of the model, you scroll to the next 1 minute video and you only realize it's boring once you're already into it. And that's not some cost. Yeah, that's a good question. Then yeah, you can look at both of these. So the simplest version would be, I only realize the value when I get there. It's memoryless because at some moment I'm going to switch off. And I just keep going, which means my decision to continue sort of looks about the same, at every moment while I'm still engaged. Okay, so 3 key properties of the contents: the value, the expected net utility per item, the satiation parameter, the probability Q that system 2 remains interested per item, and again, borrowing a term from the behavioral sciences, the moorishness of the content, the extent to which system 1 wants more, and probably P that system 1 is in control and consuming the content. Right? Because if system 1 is getting utility, actually the decision is out of system 2's hands, right? So the way the decision making is going to work is if system 1 is engaged, it just goes on. It doesn't matter if system 2 wants to leave or not. Every time system 1 experiences negative utility, it temporarily switches off, it loses interest. And system 2 gets one of its rare chances to decide, do I want to leave now? And for that, it can engage in this calculation that involves the futures. And if it decides to continue, it doesn't get to make a decision necessarily the very next step because system 1 is back in control potentially, right? And potentially for this long period of time. Yeah.
Clarification question: when system 1 is in control for a sequence of time, still the Q discounting keeps happening?
It keeps happening, yeah. Exactly. So at some moment during a run, and so you should think of the session as running in these bursts. System 1 sprints along, dragging system 2 with it. In there, system 2 is still deriving utility, which could be positive. Right? System 2 is like, but then at some point system 2 satiates and keeps getting dragged along. Yeah. And so again, we can really think of it as, the story of system 1 and system 2 are at a party. At some point, system 2 wants to go home, but they have to extract system 1, who's impulsively still having a conversation with people at the party. So, and that's sort of what the analysis looks like. So let's actually, one advantage of setting up the model in this simple way is we can actually do the entire calculation, get a pair of equations that's kind of clever. So the user session just looks like what it looks like, but for the analysis purposes, we could divide it into conceptually 2 phases. The part where system 2 still wants to be there, and the part where system 2 has satiated. Right, phase 1 and phase 2. So while system 2 wants to be there, it's collecting V bar W net utility per step, V bar minus W. And it's memoryless. So from any point in phase 1, the expected number of steps left in phase 1 is this expectation of just this coin flipping variable, 1 over 1 minus 2. That's what the expected utility from phase 1 is V bar minus W over 1 minus 2. Okay. At some point, system 2 satiates. Now we enter phase 2, right? It doesn't get to leave because system 1 might be engaged. It might be in this long run of being engaged. So system 2 in phase 2 is now collecting negative W net utility per step because it's losing its outside option and it's getting no value. And it'll stay there as long as system 1 continues to be engaged. What's the expected length of phase 2? It too is a coin flipping variable, right? With probably P, system 2 stays there. And so the length of that thing is 1 over 1 minus P. With the one caveat that you might luck out and actually system 1 is immediately not engaged. And so it's P over 1 minus P rather than 1 over 1. All right. So that says.
That's pretty great. The way this seems to have been written, it looks like the user starts with system 2 and then switches to system 1.
Right. So
yeah,
it's a good question. So yeah, a great question. This is basically a sort of analysis that says from each moment, we can sort of tag the sequence with moments when system 2 is in control. Each moment system 2 is in control would look like this. Moments when system 1 is in control, it just forces it ahead. So this actually brings us to kind of a key modeling question, which actually is something we've discussed a lot with people at some of these large platforms. Who controls the decision to actually go on the platform in the first place? Right? Like the decision to open this app on your phone to start, is that a system 2 decision or a system 1 decision? For purposes of this analysis, we're modeling that as a system 2 decision. Right? That's a planning decision. You have to actually choose to get your phone out and go on it, knowing all the risks that you're gonna, like, oh, let me just look at this for 2 minutes, and then 20 minutes later, you're still there. But that's a risk reward calculation that system 2 is doing when they get on their phone. So in terms of, think of the very leftmost point here as the moment before you've opened the app. That's a system 2 decision, and it's doing this by much. Yeah. But I'll come back to this point actually, who's actually controlling the decision further. Great. So system 2's utility is a random variable, which is equal to the net value from phase 1, V bar minus W 1 minus Q, minus the net value from phase 2 minus DW over 1 minus P. The max of battery is 0. And that's the decision to go on the platform. Well, if you know there's going to be net negative, right? So you have an app on your phone, you try it out, it was super engaging, but in fact, so engaging that you know that in expectation, when you open it, you waste so much time that it's a net negative utility. Then you might actually delete that app from your phone if system 2 were actually in control and had sufficient measure. So it's a max of this and 0 because you always choose not to. The session length, and this is the point, right? That's utility, but utility takes place in the user's mind. The data that we most easily have, that we can most easily collect, is session, right? Is engagement. How engaged are you on the platform, right? And so, so the social media team holds their weekly meeting and they look at engagement metrics. Time on site has gone up, right? So people used to spend 17.5 minutes per session, and now they're spending 21.4 minutes, increasing engagement, right? That's session length. And session length is simply the length of phase 1 plus the length of phase 2. So we have this pair of equations, right? Expected utility, which is invisible, it's in the user's mind, and expected time on site, engagement, which we can measure in exquisite detail. We can get everything we want to know about that distribution. And so, what is the relation between these two things? The thing I can measure and the thing that we imagine that they might want to be optimized, right? And again, we're imagining this is sort of an even if story, right? Even if the platform's interests were 100% aligned with yours, they were altruistically trying to maximize your utility, they would face a communication bottleneck. They don't know how much you're actually enjoying this experience. So to what extent can they use time as a proxy for utility? So let's think about that next, right? So far, we've been taking the user's point of view. We've been saying, here's all the challenges the user faces when they go on the site and get dragged along by system 1. Let's now think about a sort of world in which we have an altruistic platform that's like, I would like to help the user maximize their utility, but I can't know what's going on in their head. I can just see what happens. So, okay, well, if p equals 0, then these two equations actually work out quite nicely. And right, so this part is like p is 0, so this second term is 0. And so we just got v bar minus w bar minus q and bar minus q. The two are just directly proportional to each other. And so in fact, engagement is a perfect proxy for utility, which actually gives us sort of the first stylized conclusion that you would like to have, which is a world where people don't think about the system 1, system 2 conflict. Optimizing for engagement is a completely natural thing to do. Your utility rises monotonically in your engagement. But if p might come from a large range, then high engagement can mean one of two things. It can mean this term is large, or it can mean that term is large. And those have opposite signs. The first term being large means I'm doing the right thing. And the second term being large means I'm doing the wrong thing. Right? And if I'm doing too much of the wrong thing, I might actually be producing negative utility, and the user might actually just not show up at all. Okay, so that suggests this interesting content design problem. Because remember, content is described by 3 things, right? The Morrisness, satiation rate, and the quality per item. And you can imagine that a platform, can't manufacture any content it wants, but it can select content from some feasible region, right? So the platform has some features, let's call them X's, that determine the content, how much of, this particular ingredient to put in, how much of this ingredient to put in. And those define basically parametric equations that move you around in PQV space, right? Trace out what you might call a content manifold of all the possible content you could produce by varying the parameters under your control, producing different PQV values. So imagine I'm doing that. But I don't necessarily know exactly what PQV are. I can measure engagement. And I want to know what is the effect of optimizing engagement on utility. Right? That's the fundamental problem that even an altruistic platform would face. So let's work through some examples just to see what happens if we try doing that. Right? So the simplest example is the one we just talked about. If p is 0, and the platform is like, okay, I have my hands on this lever called X, and I can sort of dial up or down X. And I discover as I move it, the user spends less or more time on the site. And maybe what X is actually doing is it's raising the span of the content, right? It makes you want to be there longer, and it's raising the quality. Well, then of course we're in this state where optimizing, the optimum for both T and X is to increase X as much as possible. Engagement usually will do. That's the easy case. The other extreme that we were talking about is, again, I grab hold of this lever and I modify the content. But this time, what it's actually doing is simply increasing the Morrisness. Quality rate. We just got a. owl has taken care of it. Very good. Okay, so quality remains the same, satiation remains the same, and just this lever actually, unbeknownst to me, is simply raising the Moorishness. Right? Now something interesting is happening, right? Which is if I'm just naively measuring engagement, then the more I raise X, the more time on site goes up, right? So in this curve is time on site as a function of X, which is really P. But expectation of S, the blue curve is utility. Right. So the more I raise this, right? And so this is sort of in this model, kind of the simplest expression of this anecdotal principle that teams of these social media companies worry about, that like it feels like the more we optimize, the more unhappy users get. Like what's going on? We keep giving them what they want, and they keep getting more and more unhappy. We're caught in this weird paradoxical cycle. And this is sort of the simplest expression of this paradoxical cycle. That the lever, right, the knob that you're turning is a Moorishness knob. And so you're right. Every time you guys, every Friday when you meet for your weekly meeting and to review engagement metrics, they just keep going up. But invisibly, utility keeps going down. And one day you're going to discover people don't show up at all, right? Because you've basically gotten to this point where the utility crosses zero. And so you discover like this user who is more and more engaged one day just deletes the app altogether. Right? Now, this is an extreme version of the story, right? This is just, I mean, it's rare that the knob you have under your control with content is a pure Moorishness knob. But this would be the extreme version of the story. So there are these other in-between versions of the story. Because after all, we imagine the relationship between system 1 and system 2 is more complicated, right? It's, things that are appealing to system 1 are typically appealing because there's something actually engaging about them, which system 2 also likes in moderation. System 1 and system 2 typically are just going to disagree of like how much of this they want. So, a more, we can make up other examples. And again, these are just worked examples. In the paper, we try to characterize, the entire space, which I'll give a couple slides about in a minute. But just to do one more example, maybe the lever you have increases Moorishness and also increases quality by some positive coefficient. So then we have a situation that's sort of, more kind of in between. For a while, utility and engagement are both going up until some internal maximum of utility. After which engagement keeps going. But now you've reached the max of utility and the rest of it is all a decrease, right? Which means in some parts of the space, engagement's a good signal. And in some parts of space, engagement is a bad signal. And the challenge is to figure out which is which. Okay. This last example suggests a way to create sort of a kind of arbitrary families of examples. Right? More generally, I can just imagine I have K content sources. Each one has some hidden parameters. And basically, the lever I have under my control is the mixing width. Right? How much of content type 1 do I want? How much content type 2 do I want? What do I want to put in the feed? Right? The feed is a continuous mixture of these things. And then the result is just the content feed with these mixed parameters, right? So my previous example was created from the first two by just going, I have these two sources. One has Q naught and V naught with no Moorishness. The other one has pure Moorishness with Q naught and a slightly higher quality. And what I'm doing is basically mixing between those two. There's other design choices that pop up here that become extremely natural, right? So for example, adding breaks can be used creating, a mixture where there's a source that has no Moorishness because system 1 definitely doesn't enjoy breaks. Some satiate, some span, system 2 might be willing to sit through this. And zero value because it's just a break. And the interesting thing is that you can create situations where the user would rationally decide not to be on the platform because it's going to have negative utility because there's too much Moorishness. You then announce that you're going to mix in a break with some probability, probably 2% of a break. Probably 2% your next item is a break. And now system 2 would actually rationally choose to go on the platform because they know that they will reliably have moments when they can leave. Now, it's interesting, this seems like a weird artifact of the model, but for the fact that, as you may have seen from press releases from Instagram and TikTok, they actually, with some amount of fanfare have announced we're adding breaks to the site, right? You can toggle this thing, which says, give me a break every 15 minutes, give me a break every 30 minutes, every, whatever amount of time. In some sense, this only makes sense if you believe your user is experiencing internal conflict, right? Otherwise, there's no real reason why you would say, new feature, we're going to force you to sit there for 15 seconds doing nothing every half hour, right? That's arguably to give system 2 the chance to actually get up and leave, which is essentially something that comes naturally out of this model. Like mixing in content of 0 value could actually rationally cause system 2 to show up when they wouldn't. So there's a bunch of additional things that one to do here. There are some general theorems that it's possible to prove. So here's one theorem from the paper that already holds in this model, and also in more general versions of the model. Let's imagine again I have some content manifold, so I just have some subset of PQV space. At any point in PQV space, I have the expected utility, the expected engagement, I have the optimum for utility, the optimum for engagement. And you could ask, what must be true of the content manifold if the engagement optimum produces strictly higher engagement but strictly lower utility than the utility optimum, right? What must be true in order for there to be this fracture between those two outcomes, right? Which is essentially the thing we're talking about. Trying to give an exact characterization of this is still somewhat unresolved, but I'll talk about one forward direction here. If this happens, then one of the following two things must be the case. One is that there is a system 1 conflict, so that the Moorishness at the engagement optimum is higher than the Moorishness at the utility optimum. In other words, the platform has injected too much Moorishness into the system. It turns out, though, if you actually work through the model, you discover there's a second possibility, which doesn't have to do with Moorishness, but does come out of the model, which is it's also possible that at the engagement optimum, the satiation rate is slower, so the span is longer, but the utility per item is smaller, right? So the engagement optimum, you satiate slower, but you're getting less value per item. At the utility optimum, you satiate faster and get more utility per item. And so we got this out of the model and we sort of looked to see, okay, is this just a feature of the model or does this actually mean something? But this actually does correspond to something else that people talk about at YouTube and in the old days talked about, in the early days of search engines, which is suppose I'm trying to figure out, say, how to pair my AirPods with my phone. And I go on YouTube and I say, how to pair AirPods with Apple iPhone. And I find some videos and I start watching them to figure out instructions. The good outcome is the very first video I watch, I figure it out and I leave. The bad outcome is the first video doesn't seem to really explain it. The second video is actually like an ad for some competitor AirPods. The third video also doesn't play very well. The fourth video, I finally figure out how to do it. Right? What's happened? I've gotten less utility, but I've been on the site for a while, right? Because somehow, right, I had nothing to do with Moorishness, but I had a need and it was taking me longer to fulfill it and I was getting less value per item. Whereas the ideal thing is to get you off, right? If you have a pure information need, the idea is to get you off the site as fast as possible with that information need satisfied. And that has nothing to do with Moorishness. And so in some sense, it says those are the two stories, right? One story is I stayed on, well, I got too engrossed in this. I stayed on longer than I wanted to, and I regret it. That's the system 1 story. The other is I couldn't find what I wanted. It took me too long, and I regret that, right? And in some sense, the model says one of those two things, one of those two stories must be the case in these cases, where there's a gap between the engagement and utility. Okay, so let me wrap up with a few conclusions, and I'm happy to take questions or obviously people have to go. Feel free to do that too. So, fundamentally, we start from this idea that something isn't working with platform optimization based on behavioral data, right? That we optimize and somehow users get less happy. And the idea was to think about, could part of the problem be the revealed preference assumption? And in that sense, I think what we're doing here links to lines of research that go under different names in the literature, right? So you can sort of think about value alignments in online systems as being addressing similar things through a different lens, right? The idea that we would like the objective function implemented by the platform to align with the values of the user and to try to figure out what we have misaligned between. I think also models like this help us think about the design choices that we make in a variety of ways. And some of these have come up at different points in the talk, right? One is, how to interpret the data that we collect. I see a single set of choices by the user, and I want to then interpret them as reflecting some conflict between these two, this dual processing system. the model here arguably gives, a story about how certain effects can happen. It's really only the tip of the iceberg for some kind of inferential question about, okay, now I'm giving you click data, how can you make inferences? But it does suggest certain things. So for example, we can go back and interpret surveys, right? So surveys that pop up on YouTube, how are you enjoying YouTube today on a 1 through 5 scale, right? And what is that, right? Arguably, that's YouTube trying to sort of break the fourth wall and say, could I please talk to system 2 directly, right? Because obviously a survey is not engaging to system 1. And so the fact that you're willing to answer that question means potentially system 2 is going to tell them something about how happy are you? And actually, one thing that this suggests, which we've been talking a little about with people who look at these kinds of things, it also suggests a hypothesis that your happiness is going to actually co-vary with your length into the session. Right, the way you might answer that survey early in the session might differ from how you might answer that survey late in the session. And so actually the time series of survey answers across length, aggregated over many, many users probed at different points in the session might also tell us something about more association. I didn't really talk about a number of options to display, but that comes up. We have a section paper which gets more elaborate, where the fact that you now have multiple options, right? So the YouTube sidebar that says, here are 8 things you can watch next. That has effects for both system 1 and system 2, right? Because it gives system 2, you can now potentially take the max utility of all of those. On the other hand, it makes it even more likely that system 1 will find something that it's engaged by and keep you on the site potentially even longer. So you can get situations where the optimum number of options to display has some kind of internal maximum, precisely because you want to sort of increase the utility, but not engage system 1 too much. Preview versus autoplay came up briefly, right? Hoda and Steven, you were asking about this, what if, and Hoda particularly, your question about what if I know the next video is going to be bad, right? So the idea that you're either autoplay right to the next one or not. Benefits, of course, breaks we talked about. I'll end on this question about the decision to go on the platform at all, right, as a system 2 decision. This is also an interesting question, right? What is it? How do you model the original decisions to go there? We're modeling this cost benefit analysis made by system 2, but it does say things about the way that you present the option of going on the site, the way you might, for example, embed media in other content that can actually change that calculation, change that balance. So, for example, you can imagine that someone who's very sophisticated about their media consumption might say, I often read the Washington Post, but never on Sunday morning, because on Sunday morning, the news articles often embed YouTube clips of something that happened on Saturday Night Live the night before, which Washington Post does do. And the problem is that I stay away from YouTube, but I'm reading the Washington Post article and suddenly I'm on YouTube, right? Suddenly system 1 is there, and system 1 is able to override my self-control decision to not go on YouTube because it's embedded in the middle of some other piece of media. And when we thought about that, my co-author Sendel pointed out, this actually comes up in the psychology of food consumption, right? You walk through the airport, and you're smart enough to know not to stop at the cinnamon roll place that sells 1,000-calorie cinnamon rolls. But the cinnamon roll place is smart enough to pipe the smell of the cinnamon roll out into the concourse. So that as you walk by, system 1 is already consuming the cinnamon roll, right? And so this idea of trying to, embed one medium in another doesn't just come up in media consumption. It comes up in a lot of choice architecture, where the way in which you present the choice actually can tilt the balance between who's in control of making that decision. So models like this potentially can be useful at thinking about a lot of the design choices we encounter in a kind of unified way. And overall, potentially it helps us think about, what you might call some of the behavioral foundations of data-driven algorithms, right? The fact that our choices about how to analyze the data represent not just inferential decisions, right? Decisions about how we're going to deal with the sort of limited data that we have, but also behavioral decisions, what we're going to infer about the behavioral model of the user who generated that data. To the extent that different behavioral assumptions, to what extent is there an internal conflict between the user versus they're governed by a single set of preferences, can actually dramatically affect what we make of the very same data in designing the very same site, and potentially help us deal with some of these really complicated questions about, social media consumption, conflict, happiness, and regret as we deal with all these platforms going forward. Thanks very much. Yeah, so I realize we're at the hour, so of course people have to leave. Yeah, Danny.
Well, I just, I guess there's a yellow in the room is that you're kind of assuming that these companies are somehow, egalitarian or, did you put the right word? They're good.
Altruistic, yeah.
Oh, they're altruistic,
Yeah.
right, but they're not.
They're not altruistic.
In fact, they're exactly the opposite, right? So, but you're just ignoring that whole issue, like they're trying to force you to watch ads to
Yeah.
make money, like,
Yeah.
that's.
So there's a few questions, yeah, it's a great question. So I think there's sort of, yeah, three things we saw about on this, because this is obviously a sort of, you just your insight of the model. The first actually comes from, again, sort of looking at the literature on policy interventions in domains with self-control problems, right? So there's a huge amount of work that's gone into regulating financial products and lending, right? Because it's very easy to engage for companies to engage in exploitive lending practices to basically hijack behavioral impulses that you naturally have, much in the way that we might imagine social media companies do it. There's a lot of work in the regulation of alcohol and tobacco, for example, right? How do we add taxes and surcharges to simply make it less appealing for people? And one thing that emerges from a lot of that work is that even if you believe that companies are cynically exploiting people, somehow the policy draft tend to be most useful with reference to a model of consumption in which we actually sort of make those conflicts explicit and make the desired policy outcome explicit. In some sense, that's what we're doing here, right? What would be the desired outcome? So that if we then go to regulate things, we have some understanding of what the desired outcome is. I guess the second point is this is sort of in the category of many models, which is sort of making an even if argument, right? So the greed of companies is a problem, but even if that were not present, we would face this problem, which is simply a communication problem. We actually don't know how to interpret the data that we're getting. Because I think another thing, and again, this sort of comes out of a lot of stuff I've sort of learned from working with Sendel, my co-author, some of whose past stints include working at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where he's thinking exactly about sort of predatory practices, is that in a lot of these cases, no matter what you do, you end up with a line drawing activity, right? So we might say, yes, certain platforms are cynically exploiting people's tendency to overconsume so they can make money off of ads. But really not all sites are doing it, right? So do we count like Khan Academy as doing that? Do we count Wikipedia as doing that? Do we count the Great Courses series as doing that, right? There's an enormous spectrum of content on the internet that people are consuming for all sorts of reasons. At one extreme, that seems to be happening. At some other extreme, that seems not to be happening, right? Is GitHub doing that, right? So there's the spectrum. And so trying to understand the spectrum, also understanding some of the continuous parameters, right? There's some continuous parameters that are varying there. And we'd like to understand what some of those parameters are, which also implicitly somehow feels like it's here. And then I guess the final thing, because we've thought a lot about sort of how to deal with this issue. There's something interesting about talking, and again, you may or may not agree with, or anyone may or may not agree with this, but it's interesting to actually talk to these teams at these companies, right? Because of course, the actual team presenting content at one of these large platforms, there's a bunch of people who graduate with CS degrees, and in their minds are saying, I want users to be happy, right? Like when they actually meet, like when they're actually like looking at the data and actually looking at the code, and somehow so there's a systemic problem that the company doesn't necessarily want users to be happy. The company wants the profit. The company is, has a policy carried out by agents, the employees, who basically are CS majors who are like, I want to make users happy. And so there's an interesting systemic conflict going on also, which I think is an interesting whole question in itself, which is the engineering teams who actually often in their minds believe they're altruistic, who are working in the service of a systemic structure, which is obviously potentially making money off users. I think it's something else. But yeah.
This is very interesting. I like how it's modeled. People wants. I'm wondering what happens what would happen to the model and its behavior if you were to relax that IID assumption and start asking the question, are your preferences endogenous affected by your neighbors, and your choices are affected by your neighbors?
Yeah. So so I think there's a few things you could look at there, which are all quite interesting. Right. So one is the endogeneity. Actually, so let me say, yeah. So if I took away IID, the first thing I might do is say it's not memoryless. It's stateful, for example. Then you get so we have some models which are stateful, and you get more complicated things in those situations. One thing you get, which we don't get here, is once it's not memoryless, system 2 actually has to do the calculation of you need to leave slightly before you satiate. As in, you're like, because it's stateful, because I'm satiating in a stateful way, I can predict that the end is coming. And I can predict that the next time I'll be in control, I will have already lost a bunch of utility. And so it actually sort of makes the argument that, like, rationally, you should actually leave while you're still gaining positive utility. Again, something we recognize from our experience, maybe. Endogeneity could happen both from what the platform shows me and also from what my neighbors see as you're observing. In terms of what the platform shows me, there's some interesting work by my colleague Sarah Dean at Cornell with Jamie Morgenstern, looking at, for example, as platforms recommend things and you see them, that actually might cause your preferences to switch actually genuinely toward that content, right? Like, I wasn't necessarily into these kinds of videos, but now that I've seen a bunch of them, I realize I like them. And so my preferences are actually changing under the operation of the recommendation systems. And so I have a co-evolution of recommendations of the preferences, which I think is these interesting questions. And then, yeah, I think there's these interesting questions about what if I'm actually deriving value from what neighbors are watching? Like, I'm getting recommendations from what neighbors are watching. People I know watch something and now it's being recommended to me, which I think also leads to interesting questions, both in the way in which we have a network on consumers, also ways in which we have networks on producers and consumers. So an interesting effect that you can get in a model like this is that the platform might, even for self-interest purposes, not want the consumers to overconsume, because then they'll lose utility and then they might not show up. But I want the producers to overconsume or overproduce, right? So someone who makes content on TikTok, content on YouTube, hoping it becomes popular. Those people also describe themselves as sort of trapped in a spiral of, like, they spend way too much time making content because they're chasing sort of the next, viral success. You could argue that a platform that's trying to sort of cynically maximize utility might actually somehow protect the consumers and protect their utility, but cause, sort of incentivize the producers to overproduce, because anything that the producer produces maybe hurts their utility, but raises the utility of millions of people. And so you get this interesting producer-consumer interaction also that's taking place here. So yeah, I think all those are ingredients that we've thought about trying to put to a model that's very much. Yeah.
I had the impression that psychology has moved away from system 1, system 2 thinking. Would you know why it is?
Yeah, so I think, obviously, in a way, system 1, system 2 was always a kind of high-level description of a more complicated phenomenon. I think, one is obviously the point that, there aren't just two monolithic things that are totally homogeneous, but rather there's some sort of more complicated decision about sort of progressive investment of effort as you confront the task, right? I confront a task, I try to solve it heuristically. If it doesn't work, I move on to progressively, more and more sophisticated measures. It's not clear there's just a binary distinction between I try the heuristic thing and then I move to full-blown whatever system 2 is. I think in different domains, though, like in some sense, system 1, system 2 here is kind of a sort of slight misappropriation of the term from psychology, which is more about heuristic versus deliberate problem solving. There's not really a problem solving component here. This is really about preferences and sort of dual processing. There's more evidence for sort of the dual processing preferences where, I have this sort of impulsive in the moment preferences and the long range ones. That comes out of sort of all the basic models of sort of timing consistency or quite the hyperbolic discounting have some version of that. So I agree that system 1, system 2 is sort of an oversimplification, but here it's more a stand-in for sort of preferences that operate at the present time step versus preferences that operate in sort of the future time steps. Yeah, great question.
So one question that I had was about, so the reason, if I think through why I don't like social media consumption, part of it is the kind of content, right? Not necessarily the fact that I spend too much time on it, but rather the content itself being something I think my point is that, so the dichotomy between engagement versus utilities, not just based on the time, based on the addictive nature, but also it could be that, the content is, it's as if sort of like if I'm walking on the street and someone slaps me in the face, I'm definitely engaged, what just happened, right? Obviously not happy, right? Yeah. So it's kind of, To what extent does this model also capture those situations in which the content is the reason I'm unhappy with my social media, not just how much time I spend on it, but the fact that it stresses me out, right?
Yeah, it's a good, it's a very good question. I think we've actually, this gets into more complicated parts of the model. There's a sort of last part, which actually is partly a paper that we may or may not ever try to actually fully write, where I have literally multiple types of content, and system 1 values them differently, system 2 values them differently. And now we face the issue that if system 1 keeps impulsively consuming the kind of content that it wants, that causes potentially the recommendations to be focused on that, which is the kind of content system 2 actually likes less, right? So that, because of your choices, or, as you pointed out in your question, the choices of others who are like you, whose system 1 is very active filtering into your recommendations, you end up looking at kinds of content, whereas system 2 ideally would rather spend its time on other kinds of content. And you get a bunch of interesting, like this gets even more complicated, right? One is the kind of steering among these different kinds of content. One is now the platform has these sort of programming decisions of like, what kind of content do I put when, which turn out to actually be complicated questions, even when there's no system 1 component, right? So the idea that, for example, I think we were, like you're thinking about like over the course of a, 1 hour, TV show with like multiple things happening, the idea that I'm going to save the best thing for the end to force you to sit through a lot of content, or, I am going to have like I invite a novelist to come give a reading, and everyone's there to hear the novelist give the reading. But first, the department chair stands up to give 10 minutes about their vision for the future of the department. They sort of, no, you'll sit through it because you want to hear it, right? So there's this idea of the sequencing then, so you both have the, I don't like the kind of content I'm seeing, but also the platform can now hold up the prospect of seeing the good content because it knows you'll therefore sit through the other end. And so that then makes these models very, very complicated to think about. But yeah, but I think these are very much questions.
Yes, I have a question from the Zoom chat. Adaya asks, what happens when a user in your model have multiple options to choose from for the next item they can choose?
Yeah, so that's a great question, which I have extra slide here. Right, so imagine that the user gets here and now there's I said, okay, these are your choices. So, right, so you have to extend the model slightly because so far system 1 has had a very easy task, which is if they're engaged, they just keep going. Now system 1, we need some way of system 1 being able to like choose, which so far system 1 hasn't had to choose. And so, but if you extend the model to do that, then you can actually say, yeah, okay, so I presented with multiple choices. Each one has a system 1 and system 2 utility. Let's imagine if system 1 sees anything of positive utility, it takes the max. If it sees nothing of positive utility, then now system 2 is in control. It can take the thing that's of max system 2 utility. Okay. Which again, sort of gets back. This allows you to start speaking in some of your point, Hoda, about like I can actually now choose which thing I prefer to see, but only when I'm in control. And that's in some sense part of the problem. And so in this version, now the model sort of plays out. Now I have sort of an infinite tree because I have, say, k-way branching here. Each of those leads to k-way branching. I have an infinite k-way tree rather than just an infinite path. And now I have sort of phase 1 and phase 2 running down each branch of the tree, and we need to somehow average over all the outcomes that might happen. This gets more complicated to analyze. One stylized fact is that if I look at, so this is a heat map of the optimum branching if I want to maximize engagement, and the optimum branching if I want to maximize utility. And those optimum branchings are different. And you see a particular PQ value, like here we have like optimum branching 5 for engagement, but only 3 for utility. And that reflects this fact that like the problem with is that more branching beyond a certain point causes system 1 to be engaged for even longer, because now it's taking the max of 5 things, right? It gets 5 chances to find something it wants to keep going. And so you get these very long runs of system 1, which burns away lots of utility. So often the optimum branching for utilities is going to be narrower than the optimum branching for engagement. So yeah, so it's very, very much a set of questions that you can ask this kind of model. Yeah.
So I was curious about when you mentioned that this this conflict between system 1 and system 2 on the exiting and like where it kind of crashes and there's like this
Yeah,
this end here. And I think you mentioned earlier that sometimes system 2, when it has control earlier and is receiving that positive utility, predicts that it's gonna, crash and burn later and then exits early. Do you think this plays into your assumption of like system 2 is planning to open the app the next time? Do you think this like end result, like this memory, because like a lot of this is memoryless, but I think there might be some like
here's something
stateless,
stable, yeah.
like how the last session ended and how sessions have ended in the past influences what you might want to do. And sort of like your point of like, if it was triggering content, like that might influence
Totally, yeah.
like the next.
I think I totally, in a couple ways. So one is the memorylessness makes for sort of very simple equations, which are very evocative, but in some sense, like even the most basic model, I think arguably the most natural one has a kind of more deterministic satiation. And so then, yes, so then definitely doing some anticipation of like, I know I'm going to be getting negative utility very soon. I should leave now. Certainly within one session. Now, from session to session, I think one other effect that's going on here is a learning effect on the part of the user, right? The user doesn't a priori know the PQV, like in some sense, system 2's calculation here was saying, given PQV, here's my calculation. But most websites don't come with a nutrition label that says PQV. And so you're learning those. And so therefore, this idea of like, how did the last session go, the last few sessions go, you could take as a kind of inferential process on your part. You're discovering that this has higher value P than you thought it did. And so you're updating based on that. So I think there are interesting questions where there's now also kind of like the ended type of problem where you can imagine a couple of bad experiences with a site causes me to assume a posterior on PQV that makes me rationally not want to go visit the site, even though in fact the site is actually something I would enjoy. But I've now basically stopped my exploration and I'm now going to exploit. And exploit here means I just don't want the site. Yeah. So I think all those do come up with situations.
I have a question for myself. How does this model, this shape you described, fit with the empirical data?
Yeah, so the empirical data is definitely tricky to actually, because in some sense we're talking about these sort of very high level constructs, and there's very little empirical data on utility, right? Like there are proxies for utility. There's survey results and so one thing that we've been trying to sort of get a little bit of handle on is how does this, one thing I mentioned later in the talk was the time series of survey responses as a session continues, right? This makes a concrete prediction about that, which is like how that time series should look. And we've been sort of exploring this, and I think it's still inconclusive at this point. I would say like how this do, but there are some testable predictions that come out of this. Largely, if you have access to survey results. If you have pure engagement data, it is hard to do anything because we just don't have access to utility value. But looking at things there are other things that, for example, in this paper of Smith and Milley et al., other suggestions for other ways to try getting at indirect utility data. So for example, if a user says, mute this channel, like, mute this account, don't show me any more content like this, that's a decision being made about the future, right? It's arguably not a system 1 decision because system 1 doesn't waste its time on things like, don't show me this in the future. So that's potentially also system 2 speaking. And so we could potentially look at that as a potential source of empirical data also.
So even only at the engagement level, is it common in social media platforms that you see this sharp increase of engagement and then suddenly it drops?
Well, that somebody is continuously raising P, right? So that would only be a situation where the platform is actually sort of ramping up P. That you'd see that. What would normally happen is like the constant is sort of stable somewhere, and so we'd be seeing somewhere along this curve. And the actual movement along the curve would be in situations where you're actually experimenting with something that actually is a Morrisness parameter. I mean, certainly these teams that think about this do worry that, like, about the cases of users who seem extremely engaged in the platform and then one day just abruptly go sort of cold turkey on the platform. And the question like, what could be leading to that? Like, why is it that sometimes our most engaged users are doing that? And so there is some argument that you've accidentally sort of stepped over this cliff at that point. But yeah, but it is hard to find sort of an update in those situations. That yeah. So I think like looking at time series of survey results across sessions has been the most promising thing. But yeah, it's interesting to look for. All right.
Okay, Patrick, do you want to wrap this up or?
And
questions on that?
I don't think we have anything on the Zoom, at least.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the talk.